Nobody saw the ambush coming. Not the aides shuffling papers in the back rows. Not the Republicans who had already settled into their comfortable posture of defensive applause. Not Pam Bondi herself, who had walked into that chamber with the quiet confidence of a woman who had already survived everything Washington could manufacture. Not the cameras, which had been pointed at louder, angrier, more theatrical confrontations all morning. Not even the political analysts who had cataloged every exchange and rated every performance on a sliding scale of outrage and impact. Not the journalists who had been live blogging the session with the weary efficiency of people documenting a predictable outcome. Not the committee chair who had already glanced at his watch twice before her name was called. Not a single soul in that room understood what was about to happen when Congresswoman Sydney Kamlager-Dove leaned quietly into her microphone. 3 minutes. That was all she needed. 3 minutes, 3 documents, and one attorney general who had made the catastrophic miscalculation of underestimating a woman who had done more homework than anyone else in that building that morning. Pam Bondi had a system, and it had served her brilliantly. The system was built on composure, on the strategic deployment of institutional language, on the art of answering questions with titles instead of truths, and deflecting accusations with the practiced elegance of someone who had been trained in the specific political survival skill of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. She had sat before hostile committees before. She had absorbed Jaime Raskin's surgical legal mind and Pramila Jayapal's moral clarity, and walked away from both without surrendering a single meaningful concession. She was by every visible measure a witness who had mastered the game. But Sydney Kamlager-Dove was not playing the same game. The hearing had the rhythm of routine by the time Kamlager-Dove's turn arrived. Democrats had swung and Bondi had swayed. Republicans had defended and Bondi had nodded. The whole choreography of oversight theater performing itself on schedule with the predictability of a script that everyone had memorized. Bondi's posture in those final minutes before Kamlager-Dove spoke said everything about her threat assessment. She was relaxed in the particular way of someone who believes the hard part is already behind them, who has recalibrated the room and found it manageable and settled into the quiet confidence of a witness approaching the finish line. She had miscalculated the distance remaining. Kamlager-Dove did not open with heat. She opened with a question so architecturally simple that refusing it would have been impossible. Agreeing with it felt like breathing, and the agreement itself became the first brick in a structure Bondi could not yet see being built around her. Attorney General, would you agree that the American people deserve accurate information about threats to their safety? Bondi agreed. And would you agree that it is the specific responsibility of the Department of Justice to provide that accurate information? Bondi agreed again. 2 questions. 2 affirmations. 2 bricks in a foundation that would take exactly 3 minutes to become a wall. Because what Kamlager-Dove produced next was not a charge or an accusation or a piece of partisan ammunition fired across the room for the satisfaction of firing it. What she produced was a document, her own department's document. A report compiled and published by the DOJ's own research division, dated and sourced and carrying the federal government's own seal, documenting in the careful, neutral language of official analysis that right-wing extremism had been responsible for the majority of domestic terrorist attacks in the United States over the most recent measured period. The data was not assembled by political opponents. It was not manufactured by advocacy organizations or partisan think tanks. It was the Department of Justice's own accounting of its own country's own violence, produced by the people who work in the building Pam Bondi now runs. Are you familiar with this report? Kamlager-Dove asked. The question landed with the specific weight of a question whose answer has already been anticipated and prepared for. Bondi reached for distance. She began to speak about the report in the language of someone encountering it from a measured remove, carefully not confirming how deeply familiar she was, carefully constructing the impression of a neutral reviewer, rather than the leader of the agency that had produced and then removed the document in question. She had removed it. That was the turn. That was the moment the architecture became visible to everyone watching, because Kamlager-Dove had the timeline. The report had been published. The president had made public statements declaring the radical left the singular source of dangerous extremism in America, calling them vicious, calling them horrible, declaring in the specific language of a man who believes his declarations reshape reality that the right was simply not the problem. And then, in the aftermath of those statements, the Department of Justice had quietly taken the report down from its website. No announcement, no explanation, no press release acknowledging that federal data was being removed from public access. just the quiet digital disappearance of inconvenient truth from a government server. Why was this report removed? Kamlager-Dove asked. The question was direct. It was simple. It required only a single honest sentence in response. Bondi did not provide that sentence. She pivoted. She introduced a different subject. She began speaking about immigration enforcement and the threats associated with open borders and the characterizations that various political actors had made about law enforcement priorities, steering the conversation toward terrain she had prepared and away from the question that had no safe answer. Kamlager-Dove cut through it with 5 words. "You're on my time. Answer." The room shifted. Not dramatically. Not with audible gasps or visible commotion. It shifted in the way rooms shift when the air changes, when the dynamic between 2 people at a table suddenly clarifies itself in a direction no one anticipated. Bondi did not answer. And that non-answer was its own form of devastating testimony, because there is no version of reality in which a law enforcement agency removes its own data about domestic terrorism, and that removal is innocent. There is no explanation that begins with, "We simply felt it needed updating," and ends with credibility intact. There is no universe in which the timing of that removal, following immediately the president's public declaration that the data's conclusions were wrong, means anything other than what it appears to mean. Kamlager-Dove had a second document. This one was a presidential post. Public, archived, viral. In it, Donald Trump had implied, with the specific combination of phrasing and punctuation that allows a person to say something while technically not saying it, that Democratic Governor Tim Walz might bear some connection to the murders of Melissa Hortman, a Minnesota state lawmaker, and her husband Mark, who were killed in their home by a right-wing extremist whose federal indictment Kamlager-Dove also held in her hand. Let that sequence settle for a moment. The DOJ had indicted a right-wing extremist for the murders. That indictment existed. It carried the weight of federal law and the seal of the same Department of Justice that Pam Bondi now leads. And the President of the United States had publicly floated a conspiracy theory suggesting the murders might be connected to a Democratic governor, knowing the indictment existed, knowing his own department had answered the question he was pretending was still open. "Do you agree," Kamlager-Dove asked, "that the president undermined public trust in law enforcement by implying Governor Walz was connected to the Hortman murders?" Bondi said she was not familiar with the statement. The Attorney General of the United States, responsible for overseeing the largest law enforcement apparatus in the world, who receives daily intelligence briefings, who leads the department that prosecuted the actual suspect, claimed she had not encountered one of the most widely circulated presidential social media posts of that news cycle. Kamlager-Dove did not raise her voice. "That is a disappointing response," she said, "and it is exactly why your office has a credibility problem. Because you know and I know that a right-wing extremist committed those murders, and the President of the United States told the American people something different, and you sat here and pretended not to know." Dishonest. That was the word she used. Not confused, not mistaken, not inadequately briefed. Dishonest. The same word Bondi had agreed, at the very beginning of those 3 minutes, was disqualifying in a law enforcement leader. The trap had closed. Quietly, methodically, without a single raised voice or a single moment of theatrical outrage, it had closed. Kamlager-Dove held both documents up together, the removed report and the presidential post, the federal data that said right-wing extremism was the dominant threat and the presidential claim that declared the opposite, the indictment naming a right-wing extremist, and the implication that a Democratic governor might be responsible. 2 documents, 2 realities. One department that had confirmed the truth in official records, and then allowed its leader to suggest otherwise from the most public platform in the world. "The danger from your agency," she said, "does not only come from what your department fails to investigate, it comes from what your department actively erases when the truth becomes politically inconvenient." Bondi attempted one final pivot. It was visible and it was desperate, and it confirmed everything that 3 minutes of precise questioning had already established, because a witness who has credible ground to stand on does not pivot at the moment they need it most. Kamlager-Dove did not follow her there. "Stop removing data that Americans need to make sense of threats to their safety," she said. "Stop letting a president rewrite the conclusions of your own investigators. Stop pretending you don't know things you know. The American people are not asking for perfect. They are asking for honest. And right now, you are not giving them that. She turned off her microphone. Not with drama. Not with a flourish or a pointed gesture or the kind of theatrical punctuation that turns moments into clips. She simply stopped, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and adding words to it would only dilute it. The room did not erupt. It sat with what it had just witnessed. Pam Bondi had walked into that room having survived confirmation hearings and hostile media cycles and opposition from some of the sharpest minds in Democratic oversight. She had deployed every tool in her considerable arsenal. She had used institutional language and strategic ignorance and the deflection maneuver and the pivot to safer ground. None of it had been enough, because none of it had been designed to counter an opponent who arrived not with outrage but with architecture, not with accusations but with the agency's own documents, not with heat but with a timeline that made every evasion more incriminating than the one before it. 3 minutes. That was all it took to build something that would outlast the news cycle, that would be cited in future oversight hearings, that would be referenced in legal analyses and political science classrooms and journalism schools as an example of what congressional accountability looks like when it is practiced with patience and precision rather than performance. The cameras had captured every second, every hesitation, every pivot, every moment where a direct question met a calculated silence. And in that silence, more clearly than in any answer Bondi could have given, was the shape of a decision to protect the president's narrative over her department's data, to serve the political story over the legal record, to choose comfortable evasion over uncomfortable truth in a room specifically designed to make that choice impossible to hide. Sydney Kamlager-Dove had not yelled. She had not threatened. She had not performed. She had simply read every document, built every question on the answer that came before it, and waited with absolute patience for the moment when the Attorney General of the United States ran out of room to maneuver. That moment is now on the permanent record, and the whole country is watching to see what comes next.